Ihnen allen einen wunderschönen guten Morgen. Wunderbar, dass Sie so immens zahlreich da sind und unseren beiden Gästen. Good morning, Mariana. Good morning, John. Es gab in den vielen, vielen Jahren von Sprachsalz Zehntausende von Anekdoten, die noch heute erzählt werden. Es gab aber hunderte famoser, großartiger, hinreißender Lesungen. Die letzte gerade gestern Abend von Ernst Gossner. Und es gab in diesen 22 Jahren 6 oder 11 oder 22 absolute Highlights. Ich erinnere mich da besonders gerne an ein Gespräch zwischen Peter Bixel, damals 82, und Georg Stefan Troller, damals 95 Jahre. Und die beiden Herren sprachen über Leben und Liebe und Literatur. Die beiden leben heute übrigens immer noch. Herr Troller wird im Dezember 103 Jahre alt. Er schreibt immer noch, Sie sehen, Sprachsalz hält jung. Und Sie werden sich jetzt fragen, wieso ich dieses so unhandliche, schwere Buch in Händen halte. An der Stelle kann ich es endlich loslegen, aber mit dem Buch kann ich Ihnen belegen, dass der nächste Satz, den ich sagen werde, jetzt nicht aus dem Moment erfunden ist, sondern das ist der Auftaktsatz in diesem Band mit Essays und Aufsätzen über Johns Werk. Und dieser Satz lautet: John M. Coetzee is one of the most important writers in the world today. Und wir sind immens stolz, ihn als Gast in diesem Jahr, im ersten Kufstein-Jahr, hierher geholt zu haben. Er hat eine Anreise von sagenhaften 24 Stunden am Stück hinter sich. Hat diese 24 Stunden auf sich genommen, um nach Kufstein zu kommen und um nur in diesem Jahr in Kufstein zu lesen und zu sprechen. Literaturnobelpreis, die wichtigsten englischen Literaturpreise, zum Teil mehrfach, in den letzten 50 Jahren ein großer Roman nach dem anderen. Wenn Sie mich fragen sollten, welches Buch soll ich denn als erstes von ihm lesen oder welchen Roman soll ich als nächsten von ihm kaufen, dann werde ich antworten: Kaufen Sie einen Tisch. Und dann kaufen Sie alle Bücher von John Coetzee und legen Sie alle Bücher auf den Tisch und lesen alle gleichzeitig. Und so werden Sie dann ab- und eintauchen in einen faszinierenden Kosmos, in einen Kosmos der Schönheit, der Wucht, der Grausamkeit, trunkener Nüchternheit und exzessiver Sprachpräzision. Und ich freue mich außerordentlich, dass eine Gesprächspartnerin heute Mariana Dimópulos ist, Romanautorin, Philosophin, Übersetzerin und Kosmopolitin. Ihr familiärer Hintergrund reicht von Griechenland über Spanien nach Argentinien. Seit einigen Jahren lebt sie wieder in Deutschland, in Berlin. Und ihr Deutsch ist weitaus besser, als mein Deutsch es sein tut. Und nun also ein weiteres, das 9., das 19., das 23. Highlight in der Historie von Sprachsalz, ein sorgfältig durchdachtes Gespräch in Englisch. Wenn Sie vielleicht das eine oder andere nicht verstehen, dann kommen Sie danach zu mir, zu uns, zum Festivalbüro und lassen Sie sich dann nachträglich nach dem Kauf der Bücher erklären. Wir sind den ganzen Tag für Sie da. Also ein Gespräch, sorgfältig arrangiert, über die Basis eines jeden Literaturfestivals und jeder Literatur, nämlich über Sprache. Über Sprache und Übersetzen. Wieso heißt es Muttersprache und wieso heißt es Vaterland? Und wieso heißt es nicht genau umgekehrt? Vatersprache und Mutterland. Was passiert? Gibt es Herzsprache? Gibt es Kopfsprache? Und da habe ich ein sehr schönes Zitat von Nelson Mandela gefunden, der einmal sagte: If you talk to a man in a language he understands, it goes to his head. If you talk to him in his own language, that goes to his heart. In der Quelle, wo ich dieses Zitat fand, war nicht angegeben, ob Nelson Mandela das auf Englisch sagte oder in seiner Muttersprache Xhosa. Allein in Südafrika gibt es zum Beispiel 12 sehr unterschiedliche Landessprachen. 12. Eine weniger als im Burgenland. Was passiert, wenn man eine Sprache lernt? Was passiert, wenn man die Sprache wechselt oder wechseln muss, wenn man das Land wechseln muss, wenn man zum Beispiel fliehen muss? Darüber werden Sie in der nächsten Stunde wahrhaftig Faszinierendes hören und das weltexklusiv. Denn die Gedanken basieren auf einem Buch, das Mariana und John gemeinsam, also vierhändig, interkontinental, zwischen Adelaide und Berlin geschrieben haben und das es noch gar nicht gibt. Es wird nämlich erst im nächsten Jahr in mehreren Sprachen erscheinen und vermutlich im September des nächsten Jahres auf Deutsch vorliegen. Also geben Sie heute all Ihr Geld am Büchertisch und an der Bar aus und beginnen ab morgen auf das neue Buch von John und Mariana zu sparen. Das Buch wird heißen, vermutlich, Speaking in Tongues, also in Zungen reden, so wie der nun folgende Austausch zwischen den beiden. Dann schließen will ich nun endlich mit einem Zitat eines englischen Autors, den ich seit Jahren anschreibe und immer wieder einlade, und der antwortet nicht. Der hat bis heute nicht geantwortet. Mittlerweile zweifle ich, ob seine Werke tatsächlich auch von ihm stammen, ob er überhaupt schreiben kann. Sein Name William Shakespeare. Sie alle kennen das Stück auswendig. Er hat ja auch ein Stück mit Kufstein-Bezug geschrieben, nämlich Hamlet. Und Sie wissen, dass es in Akt 3, Szene 2 so heißt: Speak the speech, I pray, as I pronounce to you, trippingly on the tongue. Und damit übergebe ich das Wort an Mariana Dimópulos und John Coetzee. The stage is all yours.
So, guten Morgen. Danke, dass Sie alle gekommen sind zu uns. Wir freuen uns sehr, hier zu sein und werden jetzt gleich anfangen mit unserer Vorstellung und Präsentation auf Englisch. Hoffentlich wird es verständlich genug. Danke und jetzt geht's los. John Coetzee and I are both novelists and both translators with an interest not only in the practice of translation as a profession, but also in the theoretical side of translation. We have been professional colleagues for a number of years, and today we hope to share with you some of our professional concerns. In any discussion about language, there is hardly a neutral position to adopt. Almost as soon as we have become aware that we possess this ancient, profoundly human tool, we discover that languages can be loved and honored, or treated with suspicion and even been destroyed. Whether we qualify as humans solely and simply because we are able to speak is still a matter of debate. It is clear, however, that language constitutes much of what we are. We use language everywhere. Everyday activities such as writing, speaking, and more complex forms of communication, usually thought of as natural, are in fact all but simple. These activities prove to affect a great deal of how we think of ourselves and how we feel about others. They reveal themselves as pervading and determining the rules that govern our world. Individuals, nations, business, and science are partially constituted by language and linguistic exchange. Books are published, sold, and read within a network of linguistic dominance. Some languages rank as high, others as low. Thus, what languages are and what they are able to do is complex, is fascinating, and sometimes is unjust. Looked at with some persistence, even the use of the most simple words, such as bread or rabbit, might turn out to be mysterious to attentive eyes. In our presentation today, the two of us would like to focus on two main topics. First, the multiplicity of languages and the threat of monolingualism. Second, the challenges of translation in a net of cultural and political differences. We are animated by the conviction that language, and what we constantly make of it, contains some clues to our relation to the world around us. And we would like to begin by questioning one of our most common assumptions with respect to our own language, that is, the idea of a mother tongue.
In mother tongue, in an ideal world, each of us would learn to speak at our mother's knee, and the language we learn from our mother would be our mother tongue. It would be the language in which the world is first revealed to us and would become the language of our heart. It would be the same language our mother learned at her mother's knee, and so on back through the generations. When we later go to school, in this ideal world I'm talking about, we would be introduced to the grammar of our mother tongue and read its literature, thereby deepening its presence inside us and its grip over us. Through its medium, we would study science, history, and philosophy, and at a certain stage in our education, we would begin to learn other languages too, learn to speak and read and write them, though never by definition as well as we speak and read and write our mother tongue. So we would learn that chleb is another word for bread and voda another word for water. But if someone were to tell us that bread is another word for chleb, we would say, no, you've got it wrong, it's the other way round. Why? Because if our mother tongue happens to be English, bread will be the natural word for bread, and the words of our mother tongue are to us the natural words for the way the world is. But unfortunately, this is not an ideal world, or at least not for all of us. In the less than ideal world that actually obtains, many of us, having learnt our mother tongue at our mother's knee and having received our first few years of schooling through the medium of our mother tongue, will thereafter continue our education through the medium of a larger and more important language, a national language like Hindi or an imperial language like English or Spanish. We will thus get used to inhabiting two linguistic spheres: the private sphere of the minor language, our mother tongue, which we will share with family and immediate community, and the public sphere of the major language. To get our discussion moving, I'd like us to reflect on the millions of people who live such a dual linguistic life, and specifically on those among them who make a living by writing. So, I ask, what is it like to have Guarani as your mother tongue, but to make a living by reading and writing in Portuguese? What is it like to make a living by reading and writing in English when your mother tongue is Zulu? The pervasiveness of this situation, what I call living a dual linguistic life, seems to me to complicate the notion of mother tongue. For many members of the world intelligentsia, the mother tongue is no longer the language in which they do their thinking. Yet at the same time, in the language in which they think, there inheres an uneasy, foreign feel.
Well, speaking of mothers and languages suggest an intimate scene. A toddler, small children and an adult, a toy may be something to eat or to drink. This is how we all learn to speak. The child begins repeating some sounds like water or Wasser, associating them with things and experiences, so the tale goes. But today we know that first language learning begins at a very early stage, even during the first months of life. But it takes a long time for the child to utter the words needed to gradually become a dynamic part of its environment, which is more than eating and surviving. The objects named by the child are quotidian and simple. Names used by adults and learned by children leave an imprint on the world of their sentiments. Probably we learn to feel a word in those first years, not merely to use it. We thus prefer the word water or Wasser because we were back then open to the connection between feelings and words. We fall in love with words naturally in our first years. As adults, we can learn to love new words, but falling in love with them involves new efforts and new risks.
Mariana, I can guess what you mean by feeling a word or loving a word, but perhaps for the sake of clarity, you ought to spell out your meaning.
Of course. I mean the kind of strong feeling that we all have with some words that seem both natural and necessary to our ears and our hearts. This is an old debate whether the names we give to things are natural or are conventional. But why? Just think that there are approximately 6,000 languages in the world. 6,000. It would be naive to believe that our names, that the names each of us has learned during childhood, are the exclusively natural correspondence to things around us. So I can only imagine then, in acquiring those names during our first years, we simply fell in love with them. By love, I mean a strong feeling. We all know the feeling of a necessity, but a necessity that has nothing to do with rational thinking or logical inference. The metaphor also holds because love can be a cumulative process. So later in life, we can learn to love new words for breath, such as brought or here.
Let me concentrate here on what you've said about the mother tongue or our mother tongue, where I have two observations to make. First, how exactly does a child acquire language? This is a subject that has been much studied by linguists. There's an observation that I remember particularly well, that the baby's first attempts at vocalization, the stage that in English is called babbling, with reference to the Tower of Babel, can in fact be interpreted as an exploration by the baby of the phonetic possibilities of our vocal apparatus. In other words, the newborn child enters the world capable of producing a range of sounds that have not yet been divided up into meaningful or potentially meaningful segments. The child begins with the merely phonetic and progresses towards the phonological. Similarly, the child begins life without a usable concept of the word. Mm-hmm. Indeed, without a usable concept of meaning, of any linkage between the sound stream that issues from its lips and the world outside it. And then, by some complex process that undoubtedly in human beings has an innate neurological component, first constructs the notion of the word, and then step by step the system which we call grammar, by which words are linked in utterances. And the point I'm making here is that this process is not, or not yet, mother tongue acquisition, even though the child's real-life mother may be an intimate collaborator. It is instead an acquisition of the idea of language itself. Because one can't produce a sound in the abstract, the idea of a sound, or a word in the abstract, the idea of a word. The language that the child is in the process of acquiring is necessarily embodied in the language of the mother. But it is in fact language itself, not a particular language. That comes later.
Well, this is an intriguing and very controversial issue. We have been dealing with this question over the past 300 years at least. I will try to provide some answers to the questions you raise here. First, it seems well established that babies are not a tabula rasa when they start to learn a language. Human beings, more than any other species, are hardwired for languages, linguists say, or for language as a capacity, as an ability. Scientific evidence shows that babies perceive vowels and consonants as categories, for example, at least as we understand that difference as speakers of alphabetically encoded languages, because there are many systems of how we describe sounds of a language. We alphabetically learned people, we talk about vowels and consonants. Fact is that in any language, we sing something meaningful when we speak a language. Just try to imagine a language you cannot understand, and it sounds like a melody. It has a movement. It should be just like agreeable or not agreeable, but melodic in some way. So as a leading neurolinguist puts it, babies behave like statisticians. Through this mechanism, they identify certain words that occur frequently, obtaining this knowledge long before they will be able to utter their first words. There is also a lot of learning of grammar rules in this first period. The more the child evolves, the more complex the world around it becomes. Whether adults talk in front of the child and whether they take time to talk to their infants seems to be fundamental. Language, first appearing as private, reveals ultimately itself as a social thing, a social phenomenon. Eventually, the number of people around us, we call them family and friends, increases significantly, and the language that used to be coherent, familiar, comfortable to us discloses its rules, its exceptions, its complexity. We then begin to talk with unfamiliar people we go to school. What has happened to us as child who usually speak one or two languages? Mother tongue, the tongue of our family, has become wedded to fatherland. This union, this marriage has always existed in some way or other, but has been institutionalized only in the past centuries. The marriage can be more or less forced. It seems particularly forced when our first language is not the official language, when at school we are compelled to learn a new and dominant tongue which is not our first. How does this development occur? A dangerous and, in my view, a false idea took over the minds and hearts of statesmen, generals, educators, and others, that if a country wanted to be stable, unified, and prosperous, it should have a single official language. This is why the formidable process of teaching a significant part of humanity how to read and how to write over the past 200 years has both been revolutionary and cruel.
I'd like to take up the story that you tell about the child who learns one language at home, mother tongue, and then is made to speak another language at school, the father tongue. We're obviously moving here, as you say, into the political dimension of language. On this theme, let me say something about my personal linguistic background and the linguistic background of the family I come from. It's a history that may seem complicated at first sight, but I would argue is more representative of the world of the 20th and 21st century than might at first seem. So, on my mother's side, I am descended from a Pole who left Europe in the 1880s. Born in Prussian-ruled Silesia, he decided early in life that the future was German. Accordingly, he Germanized himself by changing his name, attending a German school, and marrying a German girl. Their children, born in the United States, spoke German at home and English in public. From the United States, they moved to South Africa, where they continued their bilingual German-English practices, even though they were now living in a Dutch-speaking environment. What I've told you thus far is a story of how, for the sake of social advancement, a mother tongue, first Polish, then German, was abandoned in favor of a father tongue, first German, then English. On my father's side, I'm descended from people who migrated from the Netherlands to the southern tip of Africa in the 17th century. During the Napoleonic Wars, this little Dutch colony was taken over by the British, and its inhabitants became subjects of the British Crown. My ancestors accommodated themselves to their new masters, conducting their public life in English while continuing to speak Dutch at home. Dutch, which in its heavily creolized form would become known as Afrikaans. Again, we have a story of a mother tongue, Dutch, being abandoned in favor of a more powerful father tongue, English.
Well, the picture you give of South African linguistic conditions, as illustrated by your personal story, has some points in common with a linguistic impact of European immigration into Spanish-speaking Argentina, which took place between the 1870s and the 1930s, with a second peak immediately after World War II. The other crucial event of linguistic merging in South America had, of course, already taken place. It was the outcome of Spanish and Portuguese colonial migration and the resulting linguistic pressure of the languages of the indigenous peoples after the Conquista. In the 19th century, nation-states took over the mission of standardizing central languages and subjugating indigenous populations through language. And then the process of partial fusion and general domination became official policy. This is where schools make their part. Only in the last 30 years have a series of new regulations in Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Argentina started to reflect the real multilingual existence and reality of these countries. But coming back to European immigration, the history of my family may provide as well a good example. My mother was born in Spain and immigrated with her parents, brothers, and sisters to Buenos Aires in 1950. On this side of my genealogical tree, there have always been people who spoke with a slight peninsular accent and who never mastered the autochthonous use of the second person in Argentinian vernacular, but no more than that. My father was born in Argentina, but his parents were both Greek. He came in contact with Spanish on the streets of his neighborhood even before his schooling and learned to speak this language, Spanish, with no accent. With his sister and mother, however, he always spoke Greek, a language he never taught to us, to his own children. When my grandmother, Greek side, grew old, she forgot Spanish, a language he had learned when she was about 35, but never mastered. I remember going to visit her with my father and just watching them interacting in their tongue in dialogues I couldn't understand a word of. Is the role of Spanish in Argentina, as my story pictures it, to be compared with the role of English in South Africa?
Yes, I believe so, and the parallels are enlightening. In my case, in both the maternal and the paternal sides of my family, English, the master tongue, seemed to be the way of the future, and an English language education the best way of ensuring that a child would prosper. So by the time I arrived on the scene in the 1940s, the reactionary Afrikaner nationalist movement was on the point of taking over political power. The current that had borne so many Afrikaans speakers into Anglophony began to be reversed, and a cohort of children like myself was left stranded, at home neither among the Afrikaner nationalist majority nor among the suddenly powerless Anglo minority. So the phenomenon of which I was an instance, the child who masters the English language but is not a member of the Anglo culture, was not uncommon across British colonies in Africa and Asia. As British control weakened and withdrew after 1945, significant minorities were left behind. Middle-class so-called natives, who, attracted by the material advancement promised by British-dominated commerce and government, had done their best to anglicize themselves. Even in their isolated position in the newly independent nations, such minorities continue to feel they belong to a worldwide Anglo culture whose center was now perhaps the United States rather than Britain.
Well, I think these developments are specific to South Africa, but they offer a clear example, in my view, of how the conflict between languages can quickly become political. How did this constellation influence your life as a writer?
As a writer. As a child, I found at school that I was good at English. I seemed to have an intuitive feel for the language. At the age of 17, I enrolled to study mathematics at the University of Cape Town, but also took courses in the subject called English Language and Literature. Founded on the values of British liberalism, the University of Cape Town was the institutional embodiment of a belief so deep that it barely needed to be articulated in progress. Humankind was on a progressive historical trajectory, and by a decree of divine providence, the British race had been entrusted with leading that upward drive. In my courses in English, I competed successfully with Anglo-South African classmates. I knew their language, it seemed, as well as they did. After graduating, I went to live and work in London, heart of the old empire. I adapted my colonial way of speaking and my colonial manners. With my white skin, I could soon pass undetected in the crowd. After years in England, I moved on to the United States to continue my education in the humanities, then returned to South Africa, where I was hired to teach English language and literature at the same institution whose portals I had entered as a student 15 years before. And there was a certain historical irony in this return. With not a drop of English blood in my veins and with an abiding skepticism about the ideology of progress, I was being entrusted with conveying the values enshrined in the English language and its literature to the sons and daughters of Anglo-South Africa. And I became a writer too, in English, an English writer in the sense that I wrote in the English language, though, to use your metaphor, I treated the language as if it were foreign to me. I wrote novels which were published in New York and London, the twin centers of English language publishing. Since I was neither American nor British, my books were listed in their catalogues under the catch-all title World Literature. I was also widely translated at a time in history when many more books were translated out of English than into English. Why was this so? The answer I received from the book industry, that English speakers were on the whole not curious about the outside world, was only partly true. A fuller answer would have been that English speakers could afford to be indifferent to the outside world, whereas the outside world could not afford to ignore the Anglo world, and in particular the United States. Thus, it was only natural that foreigners should want to translate books from the Anglosphere into their own languages, whereas to be translated from a foreign language into English was a mark of distinction. As the United States had become master of the world, so the language of the United States had become the language of the world. One could travel the globe and get by with English. Foreigners learned to speak English. That was the rule. It was not really necessary for Anglos to learn foreign languages. I visited Iceland, and in Reykjavik met 2 adolescent boys, sons of my host there, who told me in excellent English that they disliked their native Icelandic. The language was too difficult and anyway had no future. The future belonged to English. They sounded to me as I must have sounded a generation earlier. Perhaps they too would end up as professors of English. At more or less the same moment, I began to question my position in the system as an assimilated foreigner whose very mastery of the master language seemed to confirm that it was only natural that English should rule the world. I had always felt foreign in Anglo culture, felt like an imposter. Now, the language I spoke and wrote so well that it could well have been mistaken for my mother tongue, began to feel foreign too. Foreign to me, and foreign to Africa too, where it had never taken root and had never tried to take root, had remained the language of the masters from across the seas. The language of my books began, for me, to take on a more abstract quality. I had lost interest in sounding like a native, that is, a native English speaker. What was going on? I told myself I was feeling my way towards a rootless language, a language divorced from any sociocultural home. If I had known Esperanto, if I had been confident that Esperanto had the expressive resources I needed, I might at that moment have turned to writing in Esperanto. I'd always checked translations of my books when they were translated into languages that I had some knowledge of. Now I began to work more closely with my translators with a new interest in how I sounded outside the English language. I began to ask myself why the versions of my stories that my translators produced had to faithfully follow the English, why they had to carry a label saying that they were not the original story. Did a translation necessarily have to have a secondary status, the status of an imitation, an imperfect imitation of a unique original?
Well, this is a point often contested among translators, but originals exert a fascination all of their own beyond this particular field of translation. This is a phenomenon that does not only concern translation. Take, for example, a canvas by an old painting master. It is immensely more valuable than a copy, even if the normal human eye would never tell the difference. Just as in reproductions of a work of art, in translation there is the undeniable temporal order in the relation with its original. Reproductions and translations come always afterwards. It is impossible to reverse this order, even when the first text has disappeared and only translation has survived, something that is not uncommon in old manuscript traditions or in paintings or in sculptures. Think of Greek sculptures that only survived in a Roman form, but the originals were Greek, no doubt. Walter Benjamin, the German critic and philosopher, wrote a brief theory of translation that elaborates upon this well-established idea of original and translation. The title of his essay is The Task of the Translator, die Aufgabe des Übersetzers. Here, Benjamin considers translation in the long run as a vehicle for the afterlife of literary works of art. Given the temporal nature of languages, because languages are perishable just like any other thing alive, so languages die, a piece of writing that has never been translated into a new language will eventually vanish with the tongue in which it had been originally written. So translation is a guarantee for the persistence of a set of text called classics, translated over centuries from their original versions to new and more vivid languages. Having explained this process in the historical dimension, Benjamin extends the picture to an hypothetical end of time of languages.